Oh, hello. In order to talk about our spooky selection for today, I'm going to start by taking us back to the pre-Christian era of Northern Europe. The earliest records of the Germanic people and their religious traditions were taken down by the historians of the conquering Roman empires that entered this area around the end of the 1st century. There's no telling how old what we now refer to as Norse mythology was when the tales of Odin and Thor and the rest were finally written down by Italian guys like Tacitus. What we can be fairly certain of is the popularity of one folktale that found its way into almost every quote-unquote barbarian area of Europe, from France to Norway to Germany, and that is the legend of Die Wilde Jagd, the Wild Hunt. Call this one of the original urban legends. Goes like this. A friend of a friend was out in a field late one night when he heard a great rumbling up in the sky. All of a sudden, the entire horizon exploded as the great god Odin and his mighty hounds led the souls of the dead on horseback as they thunder across the sky in pursuit of some unseen game. According to the various versions of the tradition, seeing the wild hunt could be an omen that presages an upcoming war, a plague, or some other kind of mass death. It could also mean death for the person who sees it, and thereupon is compelled to join the wild hunt. Jacob Grimm, one half of the famous Grimm brothers, probably did the most to popularize the myth of Die Wilde Jagd when he published his own spiced-up version in Deutsche Mythologie, his comparative mythology book from 1835. Folklorists are still mad at the Grimm brothers. It's a whole thing. I won't go into it. Instead, let's jump ahead to the end of the 19th century in the American West. Nowadays, if anybody says the phrase Western music, they usually say the word country in front of it. But there was a time before the record business heads in New York created the term country and Western, when Western was its own fairly distinct genre, and within that genre was the subgenre of cowboy songs. Men who worked long days on the range would wind down those days sitting by campfires and swapping stories and songs about hardship faced upon the trail. Since pianos were too heavy to lug around on horseback, this is when Spanish and Mexican-made acoustic guitars really took off with cowboys on the western plains. Even today, the first chords you learn on a guitar are still called cowboy chords for this reason. The distinct yips and yells that cowboys would holler at one another to communicate across vast spaces while on a cattle drive also got incorporated into these songs. Yipee-Ki-Yay, motherfucker. The cowboy singing tradition would probably have remained fairly localized to the American West if not for the invention of mass media. In 1925, Carl T. Sprague of Texas recorded the cowboy song When the Work's All Done This Fall. That song would go on to sell 1 million copies. All of a sudden, the simple, 3-chord cowboy songs had become a national sensation. But that was nothing compared to what would happen 2 years later when Warner Brothers changed everything with the world's first sound film. All of a sudden, those great silent westerns were deader than Wild Bill, and the new westerns were going to need a soundtrack. Films depicting singing cowboys like Gene Autry and Roy Rogers made the music extremely popular throughout the 1930s and 40s, and it has had frequent revivals ever since. Shout out to Tim Blake Nelson as Buster Scruggs on Netflix. This rise in popularity of cowboy songs led many Americans to believe the Old West was nothing but singing and cattle calling, and when they wanted to visit those places, they wanted and expected what they would call a quote-unquote authentic experience. That brings us to the writer of today's spooky song. Stan Jones was born in 1914 and grew up on a ranch in Cochise County, Arizona. He paid his way through college competing in rodeos. He worked as a forest firefighter and then as a park ranger in Death Valley National Park. It was during this time Stan also began playing guitar and writing songs as a hobby. While speaking to tour groups in Death Valley, Stan would sing and play guitar for the tourists using one of his originals as a demonstration of the cowboy singing tradition. That song was called Ghost Riders in the Sky. In the song, Stan combined Grimm's tale of Die Wilde Jagd with some Apache Indian traditions that he'd learned growing up in Arizona. Specifically that the souls of the dead would go up to live as spirits in the sky. Stan wove together the two powerful images into a moralizing narrative about a sinner cowboy witnessing the damned souls of his ilk that came before, stampeding across the sky in their own version of the wild hunt as they try to catch the devil's herd of steer. At the end of the song, one of the ghouls tells the sinner Cowboy to change his ways or else he'll have to join the Wilde Jagd. The image is plenty spooky, and it's a song that sounds as ancient as the prairie itself, and decidedly not just something a guy named Stan wrote to impress tourists, even though that's exactly what it is. Stan Jones recorded the song himself in 1948 before handing it off to megastar Burl Ives, who recorded it the next year. The song stayed on the charts for 6 weeks in 1949, and suddenly Ghost Riders was off to the races. This song became an instant standard of the newly minted country and western genre. I'd venture to say that almost any player of country or folk music at least knows the tune. There are over 50 documented recorded covers of this song, and no matter how you dress it up, the song is always reliably great. There's an incredibly cheesy 60s version of it by Tom Jones on YouTube that you just gotta see. Dick Dale and the Ventures both did badass surf rock instrumental versions of the song. Debbie Harry did a super fun trance version in the late 90s. It's also been recorded internationally in over 18 different languages. No doubt about it, this is a spooky song that people know, and choosing my favorite from a bajillion versions is hard, so I'm just going to keep it simple. From Atlanta, Georgia, this is Johnny Seay with his 1961 version of today's spooky selection, Ghost Riders in the Sky.